Hello, my name is Emma and this channel is all about sewing, mainly hand sewing. So thank you for joining me today. Today's video is going to be all about scrappy patchwork. I'm going to share lots of tips and tricks for how I go about scrappy patchwork, which really is the main sort of patchwork that I do. I'm going to share how to make it look cohesive and talk you through my process, and also talk about how I store my scraps and what I do with them. So I really hope that you'll find today's video packed full of useful tips and tricks. So first of all, scrappy patchwork. It sounds a bit negative when we use the word scrappy because we think of scraps as our leftovers that we just don't know what to do with anymore. And yes, they can be that sometimes, but I really view my scraps as a paint palette. I think of that box of scraps as a world of possibilities because I love creating pieces that have a bit of everything in them but then sort of work cohesively at the same time. So I find scraps to be really exciting in that way, and I just love working with them. So when I use the term scrappy, what I'm really saying is I'm pulling fabrics from different collections. I rarely ever use fabrics all from one collection because I just like the nature of putting different things together. And it's not always easy. It's sometimes really hard to take a step back and look at something and think, you know, does that work? So I'm going to share all of the tips that I've got in this video, so hopefully it will be really useful. So first of all, scraps, where do they come from? Well, I have a lot of leftover scraps from previous projects, and if you're a quilter or a patchworker, you may do as well. A lot of my pieces tend to be on the smaller side because I don't buy large cuts of fabric very often. A fat quarter will be the biggest piece that I'll ever go for, really. So there are different ways to organise your scraps. A lot of people like to do it by colour, but because I go for a lot of multicoloured prints, that's what I'm drawn to. That wouldn't really work for me. So I'd organise mine by size. Now, if you make big quilts, you might have baskets of 2.5-inch strips, 3-inch strips, etc. But because I don't really work in that way, I just organise mine roughly by size. So I have a basket of pieces that are quite large but smaller than a fat quarter, and I put them in there. And I also have a box for pieces that are still what I would consider to be quite large, but they are smaller than the ones in that basket. So, you know, sort of like roughly 10-inch square pieces, that sort of thing. And then I have a box for even smaller pieces, and I do tend to keep most scraps that are left over from a project. If I can get a 1/2-inch hexagon out of it, then I will keep it. I used to keep even the very tiny bits, but there really isn't much you can do with the tiny pieces. Maybe use them as stuffing in something. But yeah, now if I can get a 1/2-inch hexagon out of a piece, then I'll keep it. So a piece that is 1 inch square is useful to me. I do also have a separate basket for solid fabric. And solid fabric is something I use a lot in my patchwork pieces, and I think it's quite an important element of what I create because, and we'll talk about this a bit later on, solid fabric gives the eye a place to rest. And when you've got scrappy patchwork, it's often really quite busy. So having the solid fabric breaks things up a little bit, and I think that's really important. And I like to embellish my pieces as well. So if you haven't seen my work before, I will show you some of those with embroidery on. And I like to have solid fabric for the embroidered parts, because otherwise it just wouldn't stand out, because I do tend to go for really busy prints and solids, and that combination just seems to work. So scraps can multiply, can't they? And it doesn't take long before you feel like you've got more fabric than you started with. And I think that's the nature of cutting it up, and it just seems to feel like more and more and more. So there are a couple of things that you can do to sort of get on top of your scraps, and there's a couple of things that I try to work on. I don't do this enough, but for example, I have this little tin here, and in here I'm making Suffolk puffs, and I think in America they're called yo-yos. So you can buy a little clover tool to make those. And so what I'm trying to do is just cut my scraps into rough circles and have them all ready in the tin and then when I'm ready to work on them, I have my tool in here and some needles and thread, and then I can just create these little Suffolk puffs. And I would like to create maybe a cushion cover with these one day. So it's nice to have a little tin with some scraps set aside for a project. I've got a whole mix of colours in here, and I'm not really worried about that at the moment. I'm just working my way through them, and then I will put them together and see how they work together when I'm ready to put them into a project. Another little idea for the Suffolk puffs is maybe to make a little garland. So here in my studio, I have a garland over on one of the shelves, and they are in heart-shaped Suffolk puffs. They're all in pink. So it's just a nice little decorative piece just to have on display, and a nice way to use up your scraps, and then you can look at them and they're really pretty. So another thing that I like to do with my scraps is turn them into hexagons, because I'm going to use hexagons in pretty much everything that I make, and I have people come here for workshops and things, so it's nice to have some hexagons already basted, ready for people to play around with. So first of all, I've got a tin here with lots of 1-inch hexagons, and one day I might turn these into a quilt or maybe a cushion cover or something, but I've just got them all prepped and ready. So again, it's another little tin of things, so when I've got 5 minutes I can pick up some of my scraps and just add to this. There's no colour palette, there's no rhyme or reason with these. It's just a way of sort of processing my scraps, making them into something that will be used in the future. And you know, if you want to make a quilt out of 1-inch hexagons, it's going to take a long time, so doing little and often and processing them, if you like, into these shapes is just a great way of breaking up that basting process, so you're not having to do it all at once. I also do the same with smaller pieces and make them into 1/2-inch hexagons, and I store them in these little boxes. These containers are just brilliant because they have compartments in it, so you can really organise them by colour, and I use these in my workshops so people can have a look through. So it's really nice to just process any small pieces down into little 1/2-inch hexagons to do some miniature patchwork with. I have containers with the pattern fabrics in, and then I have containers with solid fabrics in as well. And these containers are just a really great way to organise things. Perfect for 1/2-inch hexagons. 1-inch hexagons wouldn't fit in here, but they are just ideal for the 1/2-inch hexagons. I've got my containers from B&M Bargains in the UK. Every now and then they do have them in there in various colours, but just search online for plastic container with compartments and you might find some in the country where you live. So that's just a couple of ways in which I sort of process my scraps, so I haven't got tons and tons and tons lying around. And I have got other videos for ideas for projects to make out of scraps, and I'll leave a link in the description box below, so after this video you could go and have a look. There's a whole playlist of scrappy project ideas. So I'd just like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, and that is Skillshare. Now, many moons ago I used to keep a journal, and I would keep swatches of my Liberty fabrics in there, so I knew the name of the print if I ever needed to find a particular fabric again. And recently I've been taking a class on Skillshare all about bookbinding, and thinking about that and using up my scraps, I think I want to start keeping a record of my Liberty fabrics again, but I want to make my own journal for it. I think there's something so nice about creating your own book, and it's something I've never done before, and I just absolutely love learning new skills. So I've been taking a class called Bookbinding Beginners Class, Making a Coptic Binding, and that is by Ido Agassi, and he is just a fantastic teacher. He explains everything so clearly. I'm really inspired to start making my own journals, learning a new skill. Skillshare is the largest online learning platform with thousands of really interesting classes on such a wide range of subjects, from knitting to crochet to quilting to watercolour illustration and so much more. If you'd like to find out more about Skillshare, there is a link in the description box below, and when you use that link, the first 500 people to do so will get 1 month of Skillshare for free. So why not check it out? You are bound to find something that really sparks your creativity on there. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. So let's talk about projects. So I really enjoy making miniature quilts, and the first one that I ever made I have here in a frame, and it is a grandmother's flower garden miniature quilt, and I named it Mabel's Garden because my grandma's called Mabel, and there is a whole story behind this quilt, and yeah, it's just a really special piece to me, and it's really what got me started in doing all of this. And in this piece you can see that I have used a whole array of fabrics, quilting cottons, there are some Liberty lawns in there. The hexagon flowers are the flower beds, and the blue pathways run in between it, and that's why it's called Grandmother's Flower Garden Quilt. When I was creating this piece, I just pulled fabrics from everywhere and didn't think too much about it. I used to really overthink fabric placement and get really hung up on should that one be there or that one be there, and when I made this piece I let go of that, and that is my first tip. Tip number 1, don't overthink it, just go for it. And it can feel really odd at first when you've been someone who carefully plans things out, but give it a go, try it out and see if it works for you. So I really changed my whole approach to patchwork when I just let go of the overthinking and just went for it, and just started pulling things together and seeing how they organically came together, and that is a process that really does work for me. So tip number 1, just let go of the overthinking and just go for it. So after creating that piece, I created a similar one, and it became the front cover of my hexagon sewing case. So if you don't know what the hexagon sewing case is, this is a sewing pattern of mine. It's actually the pattern that started my whole business, because I made this and a lot of people said, have you got a pattern for it? And I didn't, so I spent a couple of months working on that, brought the pattern out, and then the rest is history, as they say. So it's such a near and dear thing to my heart, the hexagon sewing case. But there are 2 versions of the hexagon sewing case. So there is one which uses 3/4 inch hexagons, but this one uses the 1/2 inch hexagons. And again, it's just a scrappy bit of everything where I just went for it. And I did use some solid fabrics to try and break it up a little bit, but then I put solid fabrics in other places that weren't part of the pattern of, you can see 6 around there and 1 in the centre. So having things just a little bit off kind of works as well. So yeah, that's just another tip really, is just put things in random places, and somehow random just seems to work. So after creating those, I went on to make more pieces which have embroidery in the centre. So you can see here I've used jewel shapes, and I have solid fabric here, and I've done my embroidery in the centre of the Lily of the Valley design. And around the edge I've just put lots of different hexagons. There are no repeats of fabrics in this piece. This is going to be part of a larger piece when it's all put together, but that's another tip, is if you're working with a motif, try to have no repeats of fabric, because then you're not going to be worrying about having them symmetrical or where they should be. So when I know I'm creating a block like this, for example, I just pick out 12 different fabrics straight away. Now you can see this one is much brighter than the others, so if you've got a fabric that stands out a bit more, you can have that positioned at the top. That will just draw your eye right there. But you know, on some other pieces, for example, this one, which is joined to other things at the moment, but you can see on this one I haven't got one that sort of pops out, so there's more of a cohesive look here. And you can see I've chosen fabrics in this one where blue is the predominant colour, because the embroidered flowers have blue in them. So that's another tip, pick a colour story. So when you're choosing your scraps, you might think, right, I want to make sure every piece has a bit of blue in it somewhere. It doesn't have to be the focal colour, so this one has some red in it, for example, and so does this one, but everything has blue in it, so that tells a bit of a colour story. So another tip for choosing your fabrics when you are working with scraps is to vary the type of print that you've got. So here on this hexagon needle book, you can see that I've chosen all floral prints, but this one is just a leaf print. It has no flowers in it, and this one has a white background. So every single one again is different, but it's good to really change up the type of prints that are in there. So another example on this one, you can see I've got some larger scale prints mixed in. So this one, and this one are much bigger. This one as well, much bigger scale prints than, for example, this one, where the flowers are really small, and this one and this one. So having a mixture of the scale of the print really works as well, just to create that scrappy look. So far we've looked at just letting go and not worrying about symmetry and where things should be placed, because to really get that scrappy look, it has to look a little bit all over the place, and that's kind of what makes it work. We've looked at using solid fabric to break up the eye, away from the busyness of the prints, to give the eye a place to rest and sort of let the other fabrics really sing. We've looked at creating a colour story, so making sure that maybe there's one colour that's in every single one of the pieces, but also when you're creating a block, try to use 12 completely different fabrics, or however many you need for that block, to really add to the scrappy nature. So yeah, trying not to repeat fabrics that often really does give you the scrappy look. We've also looked at using a combination of types of prints, so a contrast between a floral and maybe a leaf print, or fabrics that have more of a background, they're more spread out compared to dense fabrics where that you can't see the background very clearly, or using larger scale prints in combination with smaller scale prints. So all of the contrasts and the differences are really what help to make something look scrappy, in my opinion. So let's have a look at putting some fabrics together now, and what you can do to really make sure you're happy with the cohesive look of it overall. So I'm working here on a design board, which I have a video about how I made the design boards. I'll leave a link to that below. But it's just a nice surface to work on for two reasons. It gives me a blank canvas, if you like, but also somewhere to leave my pieces, because whenever I'm working with scrappy patchwork, especially the tiny pieces, it's going to take me a long time to stitch everything together, and it will be something I pick up and put down again. So being able to spread it out on a design board that's going to hold everything in place is really, really helpful. So I'm working on a piece for making a purse with this clasp that I've got here. So what I've done is picked out some prints, and straight away I can see that these two don't really fall in the colour story, so I might leave those out. I've got one that's sort of reading as a solid, even though it's actually a floral print. That is reading as a solid, and I would quite like to have maybe another one of those in there spread out. These two look very similar, and that one is the same, so I need to just make sure that they're not going to be next to each other, but other than that I'm not really going to overthink it. So I'm just going to start by making some rows and then I'm going to pick out some solids to break it up a little bit. So go into my box of solids and see what's going to work. So straight away I can see that I have some lilac pieces. They might look a bit white on camera, but they are actually lilac, so I think that's going to work really nicely. So I'm going to intersperse those randomly. I don't want to make a pattern necessarily with them. So it just takes some time to play around with the pieces and see what I come up with, really. So what I've done now is I've just placed my clasp on just so I can get an idea of how big I want my piece to be, And this is just me roughly working out the placement here. I found another one of those and I put it over there, and I'm just looking at how I've got everything spaced out and just creating a bit of balance between the prints, really. That one works really nicely. It's in the colour scheme where most other prints have got some lilac in them, but it really is supposed to be quite scrappy. Now, if I picked out a yellow, for example, that is going to really stand out, and it just draws the eye away from the cohesive look that I'm going for. Even though we've got bits of yellow, it doesn't really work, so I'm going to just take that one out and then just look for something else that sort of fits in. So again, got one that's more of a lilac-y piece. And yeah, I'm happy with that. So we've got the solid fabrics just dotted about to break things up a little bit, and I will add some embroidery to that once the whole piece is stitched together. So when you've got that far and you've built up what you want your piece to look at, a really good idea, and something I do quite a lot now, is take a photo of it, and looking at it through a lens and in a photograph just helps you just see it in a slightly different way. So I'm looking at this now with my eyes, but then I can see it through the viewfinder of my camera, and I can just see that it looks really nice, really balanced, and I'm really happy with it. So I'm going to leave it as it is and stitch that together. So I really hope that you have enjoyed today's video and seeing a little bit into my process of how I work with my scraps, how I process them and store them, and then how I use them to try and create a cohesive look in my patchwork. And I really hope that it has inspired you to have a go at working with your scraps, maybe to see scraps a little bit differently, to sort of see them as a painter's palette, like a painter would open up their box of paints. I like to think of my scrap box like that, because I really do think there is a world of possibilities in there for what you can create. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again soon with something else. Take care. Bye bye.